Welcome to the Peak of Possibility podcast, brought to you by PeakPath Health. If you're enjoying the show, please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Remember, if you or someone you care about is facing challenges, don't hesitate to reach out. We're here to support you on your journey to health and wellness. Okay, welcome to the show. Today's guest got sober in West LA in California in the early 90s, a time when recovery was raw, gritty, and community driven. We'll talk about recovery, getting sober, how it's evolved, and what's changed and what we can learn from like those early days. Rob Alexander is a good friend of mine, a fellow, behavioral health professional and interventionist, and a person in recovery. So thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. This is going to be fun. I always like chit-chatting with old pals. You know what I mean? Yeah. So what was West LA like back then when you were getting loaded in Venice?
So Venice was rough. Venice was known as Ghost Town. And the reason why it was known as Ghost Town is because no white people were allowed in there. I remember, I think 1991, I had a house on like 7th and Brooks, and I used to get pulled over. I rented a room, but I used to get pulled over for being white in my truck going down to my house constantly. They would pull me out of the car. Cops would pull me out, frisk me.
Because you were white?
Yeah. They were like, you're down here to get crack. You're not. And I was like, no. I live right down the block. They were like, the fuck you do. Yeah. So Ghost Town was rough. There's still little bits and pieces of it right now, but very rare. I think 10 or 15 years ago, I heard somebody got jumped walking from Abbott Kinney back to their house, and they got jumped for their iPhone, and I was like, that's the old Venice. Still
a little rough. They've definitely, especially in the last 5-6 years, cleaned it up quite a bit. During COVID, they kind of like sweeped it a bit.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So what part of that like era and that part of your personality and identity do you still carry with you today? I mean, you look like a Venice guy.
I do. I look like a thug. This is my armor. I'm covered in tattoos.
Thug, but yeah.
Shaved head, covered in tattoos. It's still the core of me. Interestingly enough, I was an angry kid. I was an angry kid with behavioral problems from a broken home. Both my parents were pretty well off. I hung out in Beverly Hills. My dad had a house in Beverly Hills. My mom had a condo in Brentwood. And by 17, I had the big middle finger up in the air. I was like, I don't want your money. I don't want anything to do with the people who you are. I want to go hang out down in Venice and Santa Monica. And it was rough down there. And that's all I wanted to do. And look, I'm not that tough. Mm-hmm. But I really liked getting dirty and gritty. It made sense and it felt like home. And
what was it that drew you to it?
I think the perception down there was that they were tough and I wanted to be that tough, even though internally I wasn't. I was kind of a broken little kid.
And how old were you?
16, 17, 18. I started going down there, and it was a cross between either the Deadheads or the Punkers. And all the punkers went to the dead shows and all the deadheads went to the punk shows. So we would go down there and, you could literally walk down the boardwalk and I'd be 16 years old and guys would be like acid, mushrooms, anything you wanted. And so we knew we could get, and every once in a while you'd get ripped off, but at the end of the day, it was worth it.
It was worth the risk.
Yeah.
Right.
It was, and it was like, you would still hit gold because there were still guys down there that were like selling really good drugs to anybody that was asking for it. And, I was a little skate rat. I was a little surfer. And I just wanted to get away from my dad had a lot of money and he desperately wanted to help me, but he didn't have the component or the personality to lean in. And so what he did is he made money and threw money at it. Mm-hmm. And I was a product of our industry from the 80s and 90s, and it was very different.
What was different about it?
There were no Malibu treatment centers. There were no, basically at that time, 91, I was 17 years old. I got arrested at Pali High for selling marijuana to an undercover police officer. Now, mind you, I wasn't selling marijuana. I was ditching school with this kid who I thought was a kid, and we would go down to Venice and split a bag of weed. But I did it 2 or 3 times, and at the end of the semester, they dragged me into the principal's office, and they said, hey, by the way, this is Officer so-and-so, and you've been selling marijuana to him, and you need to get out, and you have a juvenile case.
Oh, so it was not a kid. It was
No.
a police officer.
Full-blown 21 Jump Street.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
I would ditch school with him and teach him how to surf.
That's so crazy. How long were you, like, spending time with this guy?
It was basically just a quarter. So this was the first year that my parents allowed me to go to public school after a whole variety of like reform school for a 2-year program, boarding school, which I just raised hell at because I never got caught. And every time I went to these nice private schools, at the end of the year, they would ask me not to come back.
Right.
Because they knew I was up to no good, but they couldn't catch me. But they kept catching everybody that I was hanging out with doing a bunch of stuff. And they would constantly point the fingers at me and say like, well, we learned it from Rob.
Right.
So, yeah.
Wow, 21 jumps. So you were smoking weed with this cop for months.
I don't know. So it's like I look back on it. I mean, I'm 51. This was a long time ago. I don't know. He was kind of like, wasn't really smoking weed, but was smoking weed with us. And yeah, at the
He's
end
just always around. Yeah.
Yeah, he was around and wanted to split a bag of weed. And, we would ditch school. We would ditch school and not even go get weed and just go surfing because it was Pali. It was right on the beach.
Right.
So, yeah, it was full, Johnny Depp, 21 Jump Street. Like there was an article, my stepmom, years later, she sent me like a book that she had compiled when she was with me. And there was a news article in there about the drug bust at Pali High. And I was like, oh, shit.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
So at this point, you get kicked out of school. Did they charge you with selling to a police officer?
Oh, yeah. So.
And you're 17.
I'm 17 years old. I'm still a juvenile. My dad got me a really good lawyer. Guy's name was Charlie English. He was phenomenal. I go to court. Basically what happens is they take me to, actually not far from here, there was like a mid-Wilshire holding cell for all the adolescents. And I wait there for like 6 hours, and my dad pulls up, gets me out, puts me in the car, drives me straight to rehab.
And where did you end up going to rehab?
So back in the 90s, an adolescent rehab had to be in a hospital setting. There was a smoking room in there. You could smoke. Parents authorized it. You could go smoke, but it was a locked unit. And they sent me to St. Joseph Hospital in Burbank, and the adolescent program was called Renew Life.
And how long did you go there for?
So I got there. I was there for 2 weeks. I was able to sneak some marijuana in, and I remember.
How did you sneak it in?
Well, I had a friend, so I wasn't actually living at home when I got arrested, and I had a friend come and visit me, and I told him when he came to stick it in his waistband in the back of his pants, and he was going to come and visit me in rehab. So they authorized him coming to rehab. I gave him a big hug, grabbed it, and stuck it down my pants. I packed a cigarette, just the tip of it, with a bunch of weed, went into the smoking room after he left. You had to get a light from a staff member. They wouldn't allow you to have lighters. And I went over to the opposite corner and started smoking it. And immediately the staff member was like, I smell weed. I smell really good weed. And so he starts going around smelling everybody's cigarettes. And by the time he gets to me, the marijuana was gone.
It smelled like cigarettes.
Yeah.
Right.
And my eyes start getting bloodshot, and I'm in full panic.
Right.
I'm like, what am I doing? I'm getting high. So Thanksgiving dinner. So this is 2 weeks in. There's a Thanksgiving dinner. They unlock the door and they walk us all down there's like a conference hall set up. We're supposed to have a Thanksgiving dinner with our parents. And mind you, I'd already been asking the other kids, like, how do you get out of here? And they're like, oh, you can't. They'll chase you. They'll call the police, this, that. And so I had it in the back of my mind. They escort us all down a staircase, staff member in the front, staff member in the back. And then as soon as we get to the conference area, it's kind of like a big hall where tables are set up. They open the door and start escorting us in. There's an emergency door right there. I popped the door and I ran.
Oh my gosh.
And I ran into a parking lot. It was a parking structure. I knew they were chasing me.
And your parents are there waiting to have Thanksgiving dinner with you?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, they're there. And I hid under a car and I saw, the footsteps, and then I saw the police cars show up and start looking for me. And I remember distinctly, after everything was done, I made my way over to a Fat Burger, which was right on Barham. Mm-hmm. And I had Thanksgiving dinner there. I had a little Fat Burger and I really had no plan. Mm-hmm. After I got out,
that's how it usually is when adolescents run away. They run. Being somebody who works in the adolescent space, they will walk out the door, but usually they get as far as the Starbucks down the street, and then they just wait for you to pick them up.
Yeah, there's not a lot of thought process beyond I'm gonna get out of here. I stayed out for 2 weeks. I was, flopping on couches and using drugs and eating my friends'
food.
Just cleaning out their refrigerator and not leaving the house. And pretty quickly they were like, you got to get out of here. Mm-hmm. And a really good friend of mine, this guy Brian, was like, hey man, your dad's calling and he's looking for you. And so I called my dad and I kind of, surrendered to the fact that I needed to go in there. And I was basically court ordered there. I was court ordered to a 90-day program, and then it would all be off my record. And mind you, I turned 18 while I was in there through the process. And that was even challenging because I knew I didn't have to be there anymore.
Yeah.
But I wrote it out. I kind of tucked my tail. I did my time. And I was really good at being institutionalized. Mm-hmm. I had been to a couple of major reform schools, boarding schools.
You knew what you needed to do to get through it, right?
Yeah.
Say what you need to say, do what you need to do, that kind of thing.
There was a light at the end of the tunnel. I could do whatever I want the minute I was out of trouble. Mm-hmm. And that was my experience. My parents, even when I was a kid, I didn't want to get in trouble and get caught by my parents. I didn't care if the police were involved. Mm-hmm. But once my parents found out, I was screwed.
What would you tell a parent that's going through this with their, adolescent or even adult child? What do you think could have been done differently when you were in it?
So therapy was very different. Treatment was very different. It was much more behavior modification. We're going to force you into it. Yeah. And I remember feeling very... when I got shipped off to reform school, I felt very betrayed by both my parents. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of the time where I cut ties with them emotionally. And I think there was trauma around that, stuff that I didn't necessarily deal with. And I also didn't understand what they were trying to do. Mm-hmm. I now at this point in my life, I can recognize that they were doing absolutely the best they could with what they had in front of them. Right. And at their age, when I turned their age and I didn't have a kid and I was still hardcore in addiction, there was a light switch that went off and I was like, oh, they're doing a lot better than I ever could have at this point. Mm-hmm. And so there was kind of a reckoning there, an internal reckoning that I experienced. What would I say to them? Buckle up. Buckle up. It's going to be challenging. Get some resources, get some coaching from people in our industry. I think that's extremely helpful.
In the treatment and behavioral health industry, yeah.
And really a lot of it's going to be going against what you think is your internal parenting,
Tells
true
you
north.
Right.
What you think you're supposed to be doing is probably exactly opposite of what you should be doing. Mm-hmm. And that's tough. That's tough as a parent. I have a little daughter who I love to death, and I have that internal struggle periodically.
Right.
I remember my mom telling me for years, she was like, you're going to have a kid just like you. Hellraiser, this and that. And it's a miracle that I don't. But she's a sweetheart.
She's such a sweetheart. She is.
I don't deserve her, but she's awesome.
So eventually you do get sober, right? For a little bit.
So not really. That time I did my 90 days. I got out. I was 18. My dad bought me a brand new Jeep. Immediately started doing drugs again. Mm-hmm. This was early 1992. Started to kind of try and hold it together. I mean, at that time, it was more behavioral. I don't even know if it was, the drugs were a component. It was more like smoking weed, dropping acid. I hadn't really gotten into the hard drugs. However, all of these places that I went to, I learned about heroin. I learned about cocaine. And when I got out, I wanted to go experience it. There was a little bit of nervousness about like, hey, I'm look at these people that were sticking needles in their arms. That wasn't me, but I do want to try and smoke some heroin. Let's see what it's like.
So you cross this like little barrier, this invisible line, right?
Yeah.
And for how many years did you find yourself stuck in that cycle?
For another 3 years, 92 to 95, I was, things were progressively getting worse. Mm-hmm. I tried to go to continuation school to get my diploma. I was bored there. I had some friends in Westwood. We would go get cocaine. We would drive downtown. Eventually, I was living on the streets. I was selling meth. I was running around with guns in my waistband. At the time I had the apartment on Brooks, 8th and Brooks, in Ghost Town. I had no contact with my parents for a period of 3 years. And, I experienced all the cycles that they talk about in 12-step programs, mm-hmm. where I would do a geographic. I would move to San Francisco. But without any resources, I was living in, a music studio in the Tenderloin, with 2 heroin addicts, and I would stick needles in their arms because they were too dope sick to do it, but I wasn't using it that way yet. Mm-hmm. And then I can't hang out in San Francisco. Obviously, things aren't going well there. So then I would go back down to LA and I would couch surf for a little while, and then I'd be homeless in Venice and doing the same stuff. And I started getting arrested constantly. Mm-hmm. I think my first adult case was 1992. I got arrested for possession. I called my mom, like any thug would do, called my mom crying. And I was like, you need to get me out of jail. And it was
entitlement.
Oh, yeah. And I thought, how dare her not?
And how much entitlement do you see in the work you currently do with young people who are in the same cycle that you were in at that time?
Oh, I love it. I see myself in them. And when I sit down with somebody that's just angry and pissed and, they don't want to, the parents are telling them to do X and they're going to do Y and Z and everything else. I love them. I love the hard cases, the ones that want to fight. And I don't tell them like, you got to do X.
You can do whatever you want, right?
Yeah. I'm like, you don't have to do what your parents told you have to do. However, there's some consequences because of your behavior, and this is going to be a problem. If you want to live with the consequences, that's okay. We can leave the parents out of it. Because I remember digging my heels in. If my parents told me to do something, I was not doing that. And so like when I talk with families, I'm like, don't start dictating what you think needs to happen in front of them, because they're going to dig their heels in and do the complete opposite. Mm-hmm. And it's going to make my job a little bit harder.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
So you call mom when you're arrested?
Yeah.
Did she pick you up?
No.
Oh, good.
Crying. It was...
I say good.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel good in the moment, but in hindsight, working with people like you and I do, like that's probably the best decision she could have made.
Yeah. No, she had like an Al-Anon black belt, and she wasn't going to Al-Anon, but it was Christmas. I got arrested for possession under the influence and like possession of burglary tools, because I was like tweaking and I had a screwdriver, and they're like, you're going to, break into something, which I probably would have. And it was Christmas, and I was in the Lost Hills Sheriff Station, which they don't even house people up there anymore. And because it was a holiday, you know, it wasn't just an in and out. Like LA County was very busy, and these minor charges, they were typically kicking people out. They would send them downtown to LAMCJ, even before there was Twin Towers, and then they would kick them out in the middle of the night because your charge
like 4 a.m.
Yeah,
right. They still do that.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I spent the weekend in there, finally got in front of a judge. I spent about 5 days in there, finally got in front of the judge, and they were like, get out of here, you're on probation.
Mm-hmm.
And I never went back. You know, I never went back to court. I never went to a probation officer. So immediately I had an arrest warrant out. And the next 3 years, from 92 to 95, I just kept getting arrested, and they kept releasing me, and I kept getting arrested because it wasn't something serious enough, and they kept releasing me, you know, and I would get arrested and give them a fake name. Then I would get arrested 2 weeks later, and they were like, I remember you. And that's not your name. We actually ran your fingerprints. We know what your name is. Mm-hmm. And you know, it got so bad that I had the phone number to the payphone in the Pacific Division, which was the LAPD, the Venice department. I knew that phone number, and I knew if my friends were missing, I could call that phone number and find out if they were in jail. And I started recognizing people in there. I started seeing guys from Venice and Santa Monica, and it felt good.
You became a usual suspect.
Pretty much. You know, I was turning into a frequent flyer, and it felt good at the time, but it was so dysfunctional because
right, because you had this persona of being this, you know, badass thug, right? And so now you know all the people, so you're a part of this culture that you think is like, I don't know, makes you hard or whatever it might be.
I did. I mean, I glamorized it quite a bit. It was very different from me growing up, and yeah.
So tell me about when you eventually get sober.
4/5/95. That was my first stab at a sobriety date, and I have 5 different cases in 5 different courtrooms in Los Angeles. Finally call my dad, and I'm in LA County. I'm looking at some time, and I'm like, I think I got a problem. And that was the first time that I had that insight. Mm-hmm. And I said, Dad, I got a problem and I need some help. Is there any way you can help me? He's like, I'll get you a lawyer. And so he got me a lawyer. The lawyer was really, it was kind of, it wasn't the tiered lawyer that he had gotten me as an adolescent. It was, you know, somebody else just going to come in. He got me a deal. It was a 5-year suspended sentence. I had to, you know, they basically gave me an offer. Mm-hmm. They were like, you can either go to prison and get out, or, which was all men, or you can go to a long-term program, which had females. That was the attractive component.
Very enticing.
Yeah. And you can go to a long-term program, have a suspended sentence, be on formal probation. And so I went with obviously went to treatment. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting. I went to Cry Help. They had a contract with a lot
Just
of
for context, Cry Help is like a state-run, like pretty hardcore, gnarly facility that's been in Los Angeles for years and years, for those of you guys that don't know.
Yes. Most of the staff that worked there had a lot to do with NA becoming NA.
Mm-hmm. Narcotics Anonymous, yeah.
Yeah. And like if you got in trouble at Cry Help, they would send you out to the yard. You would either have to walk the track for hours, mm-hmm. or you would have to dig. They had a garden area, and they would give you a spoon and say, you need to start digging. And you know, eventually an hour and a half into it, you're like, what am I digging? They're like, you're digging your grave with that spoon. It was the symbolism of, you know, heroin, right. Killing yourself. And it was very behavior modification. Mm-hmm. They had a contract with California Youth Authority. They had, you know, guys getting out of prison and paroled. And this is, you know, I was sentenced to 6 months at the program. Still up to my adolescent, you know.
Bullshit.
Yeah. I mean, I you know, I met a girl. She was cute, a little mm-hmm. rehab romance. It all was fun and games, and I was risking a lot. And, you know, I look at that now and I'm like, why would I do that stuff? Like, why would I even entertain the idea of potentially getting thrown out for, you know, commiserating with a girl in rehab?
Why would you? Why do people do that?
I think there's, they still want that love. They want that. They want to feel like they're attractive. They want to feel like they're needed.
Especially when you come in and you don't believe that about yourself. If you can have somebody else validate the thing that you are seeking, then maybe you're not so bad, right? But does that work?
Temporarily.
For the moment.
It works until it doesn't. It works until they go out or you go out and you're dragging them out or they're dragging you out.
Or you go out together, right?
Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about how treatment and recovery was back then, very behavior modification, kind of break you down to build you up. And treatment is, for the most part, pretty different these days, right? Outside of just the option of going to like a high-end luxury treatment center, just the path and the journey towards assisting people in getting sober in a treatment setting is very different. What is your opinion? Is it better? Is it worse? Is it progress that we've made? Are there things that are missing in our current model that we use that they used to use back, in the 90s?
I think there's so many different dynamics to treatment that not all of them fit appropriately for everybody. And I think there was a value for me at that time. However, I did have a lot of what's called bottom envy. Like I had never been to prison. I wasn't looking at time. I wasn't, and I looked at these guys that were covered in tattoos that were fresh out of prison, and I kind of admired it to some degree. The trauma-based programs, the therapy, everything that's integrated into different components of treatment now are definitely a step forward,
Progress.
Huge step forward. However, not everybody needs that.
I mean, we were just talking about a friend of mine before the episode started. That friend can only get and stay sober in a highly structured behavior modification program. I mean, I've seen it over the years of him going in and out. So there are certain people, especially the young kids, who are just having more behavioral issues, which is resulting in substance use, where I think it can be useful and effective. It's definitely not for everyone, though. I think it could be traumatizing and counterproductive for some people as well.
Very much so. And I think that there's certain, I think if I look at myself, there was a value in the structure. And if there was trauma-focused treatment that I was able to engage with afterwards, it would have been really helpful.
Do you think that there's a scenario or is there anything that exists currently that integrates both?
Not the way that I'm perceiving it. So I think that I needed that structure and that like pull your head out of your ass, kid, this is what you're doing kind of stuff for a period of 6 months. After that, a good step down from, possibly I think that there's a lot of really good PHP and IOP programs. I didn't get that option. That wasn't available to me. It was go to a lot of NA meetings.
Go to a halfway house after.
Yeah.
Right.
And I kicked and screamed and was like, well, I want to get a 1-bedroom apartment. And they were like, you need to do it right down the street. But it kept me sober. I remained sober and went to a lot of meetings and hung out with a lot of, I had a lot of parking lot sobriety at that time. And there was an attractive component to that, which I needed. The community, we had a huge community of people that were going out to clubs. We knew doormen and sober bartenders, and we didn't have to pay and we didn't have to wait at the door. And it was Hollywood in the 90s. Like, it's so idolized. It was the beginning of reality TV with the Paris Hilton and the Nicole Richie, and we would bump into them and rub, and there'd be like 15 or 20 sober heads at those clubs. And it was awesome.
Yeah.
I needed that.
How old were you?
21 years old.
And there's so much value, because my first sobriety was at 16, right? And so when I was 18, when I turned 18, I was sober. And it was really, really, really important for me to see that as a young person coming into recovery, that you could still like enjoy life and have fun.
Yeah.
Truly.
And you didn't have to hide from the stuff that you thought you had to hide from. Like, there's this perception of when I'm going to get in recovery, this is going to be off limits. And it doesn't necessarily have to be. Maybe for a period of time, just to give you some space from it, but it doesn't have to be.
Right.
And it was a lot of fun. And unfortunately, I didn't embrace doing my own work at that time. And I think that's where an outpatient program would have helped.
Right. So you did just the fellowship and the community and the connection, which is valuable, important. But at a certain point, right,
Yeah.
it wasn't enough.
Right.
So what did sobriety teach you about your identity and ego?
So that first sobriety, a few things that I realized that, I when I came in, I had a very big ego and a low self-esteem, which is a common terminology that I hear and I really identify with. And then I noticed that girls were paying attention to me and I was having fun and I felt like I was part of the cool kids and it was great. I really needed that, but I also, and I had, certain outlier friends that were really embracing doing the work.
Mm-hmm.
And I admired them, but I wasn't willing to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I was only able to stay sober, a little over 5 years.
Right after the suspended sentence was up.
A little bit
Convenient
longer
timing.
than that,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, did you think, so you eventually go back out, you start drinking again after 5 years. How long does that next relapse last for? Or that run?
So, and it's so funny because you can look back on it and say like, oh, I did exactly, I pulled a geographic. So my dad bought a duplex in Santa Monica. I lived in the back, I fixed up the front. I had some construction skills. We rented it out. I started taking some pain pills and drinking because I don't know if I really understood that those things could be a problem for me. But when I drifted away from the program and stopped going to meetings regularly, I started wearing a t-shirt that says, I'm not an alcoholic, I'm a drunk. Alcoholics go to meetings. And like, that should have been a sign. So I decided to pull a geographic and I went to Colorado and I told my dad that like, I'm having a problem in LA and I need to move out of town. And he had a house in Vail, Colorado. And I said, can I stay there for a month and get my feet on the ground and get an apartment? He's like, I'll give you 30 days. That's it. And he kind of knew what was up. So I moved out there. All my problems came with me. I couldn't find meth. Meth at the time was kind of my drug of choice.
And that was like a West Coast thing, mostly, right?
Yeah, I had Lancaster, Palmdale. They were doing it in bathtubs and motels and like the biker crank. And I end up in Vail, Colorado. It's a small ski town. I get a job as a photographer, start hitting the bars, having fun, and things were fine for a short period of time. Within 2 years, my friends that were running the door at certain clubs were like, hey, the police have been coming in asking about a guy named Rob with tattoos. Like, you should probably get out of town. And I was, dealing coke in bars. And I wasn't very successful at it. I was doing it so I didn't have to pay so much for the coke that I was doing. And eventually after a couple of years, I kind of hightail it and I come back to California and my addiction goes off the deep end. It was already off the deep end, but I started using needles. I was selling drugs. I had some shady phone room job. The boss knew I was selling drugs to my boss because he would, he knew I was, but it was very muddled. And I was down in San Clemente. The sheriffs knew my name. They would constantly pull me over, pull me out of the car. I knew my rights, so I could get away with a few things and get away with them not searching me when I had drugs on me. And then, of course, I got caught. Eventually, they pulled me over. I didn't have my ID. They knew exactly who I was. They said, well, if you don't have your ID, we have the right to search you. They found drugs on me. And that was another kind of, I was on formal probation. I had all of this stuff kind of following me from my past of all of the charges. And there was Prop 36 at the time. And there was Prop 36 and drug court. Drug court was a little bit worse. Prop 36, you're on formal probation. You have to go in at least every other week, check in with your probation officer. And then they basically sentence you to a period of, a different component of treatment. It was like 2 meetings or 3 AA meetings a week. And then I had to go to these 2 drug court classes, which were a joke.
They were like psychoeducational type stuff. This is your brain on drugs. I've been to the classes. I know.
Yeah, it was garbage. And so there was a whole multitude. Every time I went to those classes, I got tested, and I could get somebody that I knew that was clean to give me clean urine, and I would put it in a little vial, and they wouldn't follow me into the bathroom, and I would make sure it was warm and put it in. And so all these different, checks and balances that were set up for me, I kept failing and I couldn't stop using. But the only time I would get caught is when I went into my probation officers and I had to pee in front of a probation officer. And they would, are you going to be clean this time? Absolutely. No. And I'm like, I think I had about 48 hours of sobriety, and there's, maybe there's a chance that I can, test clean. They would call me in a week and be like, you weren't clean again. So I ended up doing like 6 different violations, basically weekends in jail. And my probation officer just kept sentencing me to more treatment. And I really appreciate that. Eventually it all comes crashing down. They're like, look, you've had enough violations. You're either going to go to prison or you're going to get sober. And I called a guy who was running a sober living in San Clemente, and I was crying. And I was like, hey, man, I've had some sobriety. I've done this. I really need to check in. And mind you, they were like, you need to, I don't remember the dates exactly, but like, say it was January 3rd, I had to check in. And this was January 1st, and I'm calling him, and I'm saying, and he heard something in me. He heard the desperation, and he's like, can you test clean when you get in here? And I'm like, nope, I can't. I was like, but as soon as I get in there within 72 hours, I will. And he's like, I'll give you that shot. And that was huge. I started working all my 12 steps. This was 2004. I really leaned into the program. I went to meetings and I heard what other people's sponsors were telling them, and I would go back and try that. Like I was desperate enough to do the work, and it was magical. And I really embraced it. And, that I was able to get sober. During my amends, I went back to my probation officer and she was like, Mr. Alexander, why are you here? You're not on formal anymore. And I was like, I want to thank you. And I want to apologize to you for coming in here and testing dirty and lying to you. And she was like, you kept showing up. I was like, I don't know why you didn't throw me in jail and leave me there. She said, you kept showing up when I called you. And I don't know why I did, but I did. I felt like if I didn't do that, I was going to be going to jail for a long time. And I spent a year, kept the same job. It was my get well job.
What was it?
In a phone room.
Nice.
And doing.
They still do that. A lot of people newly sober will go work in a phone room, like 1-800, those 1-800 numbers. Hey, have you?
Yeah. It's
Can I talk to you about your car's warranty?
Totally. It's like, has somebody contacted you about your car warranty recently?
Yeah.
It's a way to make money, and people, early on in sobriety, we feel like we don't have any self-worth and we don't have any value, and that's the only thing we can do. And I moved back up to the West Side, and at that point, all of my friends were sober. I had taken a few weekends off, and in San Clemente, come up to LA, spent the weekends with some of my sober friends, got reintegrated, was very intentional, moved back, already had my meetings, everything was set up, and my life got really good. I was in my early 30s.
So do you think people can truly change, or do you think at their core they remain the same and just evolve?
That's a good question. I think they're never not going to take with them the experience that they had. They'll always have that. But I do think people can change. My knee-jerk reaction to things right now would not be as dysfunctional and disrespectful to everybody around me as it was back then.
Right. But at your core, your experiences remain the same. Maybe how you see them has shifted. Yeah.
I think the thought process and what I act on is very different. And it's become second nature to be kind, to be compassionate.
To pause for a second. I mean, what power there is to just take a deep breath before reacting and saying something you didn't mean to say, or doing something you probably shouldn't do, or, whatever that is, right?
Yeah.
So how do you transition into starting to work as an interventionist? And actually, will you tell us what an interventionist is? I know we've seen the show Intervention, but is that really how it works, or?
So, an interventionist, if you've seen the TV show Intervention, that's one style of intervention. It's called the Johnson model, and it's very confrontational and it's very disruptive to the family system. Most interventionists that I know do not touch that model.
That's the like surprise.
Yeah,
We're all here waiting for you.
confrontation. We're gonna, everyone's gonna read letters, and either you're gonna run out of here screaming and yelling at us, or you're gonna start bawling in front of us, which is great for reality TV.
Right.
Not so good for getting somebody into treatment. We do a lot of mental health interventions. There's a lot of THC induced psychosis nowadays. Young men, young women, early 20s, late 20s, early 30s. Never had a mental health issue in their life, and this is triggering stuff for them.
Specifically, the statistics are higher with young men in their late teens, early 20s. There's something about their brains or their body biologically where the brand of marijuana that we have now truly can give them a permanent thought disorder, schizophrenia, schizoaffective, that will not go away.
I worked with a phenomenal psychiatrist, and she explained it to me one time, and I really appreciated it. She said that going into psychosis is like a thin veiled wall. And there's only so many times that you can get through that wall and get back. At a certain point, you're going to get through that wall, and there's going to be no coming back. And yeah, I think that I'm not opposed to legalized marijuana. I think the biggest problem in that industry is that we've got big business and money behind it because they're creating potency. This is way more powerful than the best weed that I could have got when I was a kid. And I got some really good weed.
Right.
I was a little rich kid. Like, it was easy to get. And it's way more powerful. I've had some friends that are like, "Oh, you talking about marijuana?"
Wow.
And it really is. It's over 100 times more potent, and it's just as bad as like the tobacco industry from back in the day when they used to pump carcinogens and nicotine into the tobacco.
I feel like they probably still do.
It's across the board, but that was and it came out. And I think that that's what they're doing with marijuana products, and it's unfortunate. And these kids are getting their hands on it. They're self-medicating because it makes them feel good, or it takes away the anxiety. And they're having these experiences where, this is the introduction to them and their family of like, oh, well, now it doesn't look like drug addiction, but they're still having these crash outs, these massive crash outs. And so a lot of the interventions for mental health, we'll get everybody involved. We'll get the family members, and ultimately it's decided that like, hey, I'm just going to go in with one staff member, and we're going to go sit down with your son or your daughter in psychosis.
Have a conversation.
Yeah, we're not going to turn this into a confrontation.
And what does it look like when you're having a conversation with somebody in psychosis? I only ask because in my experience, typically you're not challenging some of the delusions. It can be really counterproductive, right?
You don't, there's a lot of electronic delusion and paranoia. There's a lot of, people are out to get me, hitmen, which doesn't help when I show up looking like I do, because I've been, how do I know you're not a hitman? How do I know you didn't kidnap my mom? We coach the family to kind of drift out as best as possible, not to support any of the behaviors, not to financially support it. And then we'll show up. You don't go up against psychosis. When they're sitting in a house and they're like, they're listening to me. You don't say, no, they aren't. What are you talking about? You say, if they are, why don't I get you out of this house? It's not safe here. And you really align with them. And you're like, hey, man, I can help you out. And that's what a really good interventionist is, a lifeline. I've gotten into with narcissistic guys, kind of a confrontational intervention. It turns into a 3-hour thing, which I don't recommend. And I've said to them, like, you're not going to like me after this. And they're, even if they don't go to treatment, they're still calling me and checking in with me. So we really create this opportunity of a lifeline. Like, I'm here for you, man. Let's get you out of this, right? There's consequences you're dealing with that you don't like.
So where's the line between helping and enabling when it comes to families, loved ones, interventionists, case managers, like when do you get to a point of, okay, this is no longer useful, it's almost hindering their journey?
Typically, it's really easy to see with family and loved ones because their knee-jerk reaction, like we talked about, is a nurturing component, but it's very dysfunctional. It's much easier when you're not emotionally attached to the situation to really give them clear, guidelines. Sometimes, it is a push and pull. You got to let them crash and burn out sometimes, and then bring them back to the table and say, hey, did you notice what you did? And it's okay to let them fall.
Right.
It's challenging. It's harder for family to allow them to crash and burn, but like they talk about, the line to success isn't linear. It's this squiggly line going up and down. And if you can create some awareness in their behavior and their patterns and not shame them for it, but, kind of highlight that and get them to, take a look at that, it's very helpful.
What is one of the most challenging cases that you've had to intervene on? Obviously, without sharing specific details, generally speaking.
The most recent one, guy's 51 years old, undiagnosed schizophrenic for 20 years, untreated.
Wow.
And he's going to the gas station and popping kratom all day long. And the detox off of kratom in and of itself is very emblematic of opiates. You go in with Suboxone and different types of medication. And I pulled him out of his house. I got him to an Airbnb.
The farmhouse?
Yeah, it was.
I remember you were texting
beautiful.
me
I was
from
like,
there.
this place is gorgeous.
In the middle of nowhere,
yeah,
right? You couldn't even get Uber Eats.
No, yeah, it was brutal. He trusted me, and he was very delusional, completely delusional, in psychosis. He really trusted me. And, I let him know, like, hey, I can introduce some medication that's going to make you feel a little bit more comfortable about the detox symptoms, but we're going to have to get to those detox symptoms. And everything that I told him was the truth. And that's one of the things, especially intervening, is like, you don't want to cloud the truth, because if you cloud the truth, at some point it's going to bite you in the ass.
Yeah, you'll lose trust. And when you've built a bridge, you want to keep that bridge, right? That doesn't mean necessarily saying yes and giving a person everything that they want, whether you're a family member or a professional, right? Yeah. But being honest and consistent and building that bridge, the time will come, right?
Yeah, it will. And so we had to, we spent about 5 days with him. We got him off the kratom. At some point, like, his brain had shut off, but his body was just like swirling around. And I would watch him and I got very little sleep the first 48 hours. And thank God I got some relief after that 48 hours. Somebody else, one of our staff, spent another 3 days with him. We were able to, and in the meantime, we were incorporating medication that were antipsychotics, but we weren't telling them they were antipsychotics because that label doesn't sit well with somebody in psychosis. And so it was, this stuff is going to help you out. This stuff is going to make you feel better. This stuff, it's going to make you a little bit groggy, and that's okay. You'll get through it. However, if you take this stuff, and so having that trust, it was fantastic. And it was magical to see somebody that was talking about how, complete deluded psychosis. I did the intervention with his sister. She sat in there and he would tell me stuff, and I would look at her and she's like, like, none of it's true. And I'm like, okay. I was like, I can help you with that.
All right.
Yeah. And we were able to get him to a program. He was really reliant on insurance, but the family was able to kind of,
work something out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They, mom and dad, desperate, wanted to see their son get a little bit of help. He had been kind of suffering away and squirreling away at this beautiful property that he owned out in the middle of nowhere. And, he was a nice guy. I really liked him. It was fun, and it was good to see him get somewhere. And he's had some challenges in residential. We still get calls, and we try and get him to, they were like, hey, he won't take certain medication. I was like, why did you call it an antipsychotic? That tells him that he's not thinking right. He doesn't want to hear that. Let's get him past the delusion so that he can look back on that and go, God, what was I thinking?
So one more question for you. what is the most impactful experience that you've had in being a person in recovery and a person who gets to work in this field? Like, what renews your love of this life and this work?
So I went out after 9 years in recovery, after this 2004 getting sober. And I went out, I got hit. I was on a motorcycle. I was in the hospital in traction for 2 months. I was in a rehab unit at Cedars-Sinai for a month after that, learning how to walk again. And I had 22 different surgeries. And at a certain point, I went back to the doctors years later because I was struggling with a lot of chronic pain. And I started taking the medication, and it wasn't a secret, but I wasn't telling anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And and it that turned into a 3-year run. That turned into another relapse. You know, my significant other came to me, and our daughter was 3 or 4 years old at the time, and she was like, "Get out." You know, we had a huge blowout in the front of the house. I had never spent any time away from my daughter, and I didn't lose it all. That was the hardest thing. I had to get a new sponsor. I had to start going to meetings again. I had to, you know, be honest about all the medication. And being a dad, the interesting thing is, and this gets me choked up every time I talk about it, but my wife and I got into a huge fight, and I had to go to detox, and there was no way. In my mind, I was like, I'm not getting fucking sober again. It's impossible. It's never going to fucking happen. I would rather stick a gun in my mouth. And I had a gun at my house. But my daughter was 4 years old, and the idea of her having a dad that killed himself or died from an OD crushed me. And I didn't get sober for myself that time. I got sober for her because she didn't deserve to have that be her story.
Right.
And it evolved, you know, and I got a little bit better, and I started caring about myself. But being a dad and thinking that I had the awareness to understand that, like, my behavior affects her.
Right.
And this is what she's going to get if I continue to choose going down this path. And I love her so much, and I'm so grateful. But that's like every time I talk about that, you know, that was 7.5, almost 8 years ago. And I'm so grateful. And I needed a purpose when I was working. So I started working back in recovery. I knew a lot of people that were treatment owners. You know, it was the only thing that I kind of felt worthy of doing, was working with my people. And now doing interventions, every time I get in there, I call us, you know, like treatment paramedics or rehab paramedics, where we go in.
Frontline workers.
Yeah. We go in, we put a bunch of Band-Aids on, and we get these people to professionals that can really help them out. And every time I see somebody it doesn't matter how bad they are, there's a moment in that situation where I look at them and I'm like, that's me.
You see you.
I never forget it. And being able to see that and recognize that for my work is so important for me to continue to, like, protect my recovery and understand that that's the most important thing for me and everybody else that's in my life.
Thank you so much. That was really moving, really powerful. I think you're going to impact and help a lot of people. And I'm so appreciative that you were able to come on the show, Rob.
Thank you for having me. You're awesome.
Yes, you are too. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the show with Rob, who shared about his recovery journey, his experience of working in the addiction and behavioral health field as an interventionist, and just his experience as being a sober dad who's had struggles throughout. So if you enjoyed the show, please like, comment, subscribe. You can find the full episode on YouTube or Spotify, and we would love to hear from you. So if you or somebody that you know is struggling, please reach out.